providing background context, I've been in the HubSpot ecosystem, 5 years after people started it, like after they went live and Dharmesh and Bryan pushed this thing out to the world. So that was back in, at this point, I think 2013. And so I've been using it over a decade in different capacities. And today versus 10 years ago, let me tell you, it's a big difference.
Okay. All right, everybody. Welcome to this episode of the RevAmp podcast. My name is Mark Lerner. I'm the Director of Growth Marketing here at DealHub. Super excited for today's guest. We have Brian Ossa, who's going to be joining us. Brian and I chatted recently on a different podcast that I co-host, and we got into a pretty interesting conversation kind of around the CRM ecosystem in general and kind of the differences between the different ecosystems. And so before we jump into, kind of jumping further into that conversation, Brian, why don't you introduce yourself to the folks at home, a little bit about yourself and what you've done and what you're doing and, how we got to have this conversation.
Heck yeah. Thanks for having me, Mark. I really appreciate it. For those of you who don't know me, which is probably most of you, my name is Brian Ossa. As title mentioned, I'm a partner at White Raven, but also I have my own consultancy and dabble in a few other businesses as well. My focus is very much at the intersection of strategy, operations, and technology. So essentially taking the concept of revenue operations, but applying it more full stack business cycle. So you can really ensure that you're aligning not just sales and marketing, but also your technology, your IT, your finance, and all of those other departments that live behind the scenes. And kind of got brought on today, as Mark mentioned, to dive into the whole CRM conversation ecosystem, because it's really been interesting the last couple of years. And I don't know about you, Mark, but the dichotomy is it's so fascinating looking at HubSpot, who's pushing so many updates a year, versus larger tools like Salesforce, who's like every quarter and nothing but.
Right. Yeah, I think the juxtaposition has never been clearer. I was before we started recording, I was letting you know that I was got into a LinkedIn conversation today because someone had made pointed out that some of the tools Salesforce that aren't core CRM but are kind of integral to it. Some of those haven't had any updates in 9 releases, so that'll be 3 years. And yeah, that's pretty wild for a company that big. But I guess there's this trade-off, or at least there's a conception of a trade-off, that the larger a company becomes, the less innovative it becomes, the more friction there is, the more the top-down pressure makes it so that they're not able to move as quickly. But in some ways, if we look at HubSpot over the last year, they've kind of been pushing back against that notion, because we see just every day there's a new, it's wild. I haven't really seen, and you actually in a previous life worked at HubSpot, right?
Yeah, that's correct. I was there until about a year and a half ago.
Right. And was the cadence of releases in the way they're doing it now kind of the same, or is this a relatively new phenomenon?
It's honestly accelerated quite dramatically, even in the last 18 months. The last, providing background context, I've been in the HubSpot ecosystem, 5 years after people started it, like after they went live and Dharmesh and Bryan pushed this thing out to the world. So that was back in, at this point, I think 2013. And so I've been using it over a decade in different capacities. And today versus 10 years ago, let me tell you, it's a big difference. But just that experience in the product release, like it's really flashing back to what things were like, between 7 and 10 years ago, where there was just so much happening all the time by this scrappy startup that's just trying to make its own share in the world and carve out users who might be using some of these other tools that are more established. And answering your question, yeah, I do think there's been a significantly accelerated release pattern. And I've been trying to figure out why. And there's speculation on it in different capacities. And like I would love to hear your perspective on that matter, because I've heard everything from, we're launching all of these things to make ourselves more marketable for the Google acquisition, which is no longer the case. We're launching all these things so that we can compete against Salesforce and be on an enterprise tier, which also is a little bit different. We've changed leadership and restructured, and this is just the dynamic of HubSpot as it is today because we're playing catch up, or it's something outside of that equation. And I have my thoughts, but like, what's your perspective? I wonder.
Yeah, I mean, to me, it does. This is purely vibes, but it feels like this is the buildup to something. That there is a concerted effort. We have this roadmap. It needs to be in place by this time, and that seems to have been a forcing function for what we're seeing. Um, and then we're speaking now in on August. We're recording this in kind of the later part of August in 2024. And so we have like less than a month till inbound. So it feels to me, again, vibes, that this is a lead up to something that would be announced at inbound. Last year's inbound was all AI all the time. And you know, it doesn't there was a huge splash about it. And yes, there are a few pieces of AI that are like, but has not been the fundamental shift that it kind of seemed like. And so I suspect that it won't be the same this year. But my take is that it is partially a play to position itself to support enterprise.
Hmm. And I think I think you have a good thought there, and that's one of my approaches and the thought that I had. But I think there's something to be said about positioning themselves for where they want to be here in a couple of years, as well as trying to reconcile what the last 2.5 to 3 years have been. Because if there's one thing we've seen, it's that the technology sector, particularly tools like HubSpot, exploded during COVID and the dawn of remote. That has since shifted quite dramatically over the last like 2 years or so. And I know a lot of companies have really struggled to make heads or tails of that and recover from what all of that looks like. And so I'm wondering if this is a attempt to regain user base or make it more attractive for users to adopt the platform and just find new subscribers. And particularly at the small business and the very small business stage, because if you look at the new seat pricing, it's not necessarily always buy the package. You can get Service Hub, you can get Sales Hub at the pro level for individual seats now. You don't need to get the minimum seat count. Uh, that said, the point you mentioned about enterprise is also really interesting because everything that HubSpot releases is a trickle down effect. It launches the enterprise first, and then it makes its way into pro and then starter and then free over time. So, where my head's at is again leaning into that play of wanting to adopt more of those early market folks. I think there's a lot of these products and features that are being released at the pro and enterprise level with the intention of being dropped down to these more accessible tiers, probably within the next 12 to 18 months, so that they continue to push for that early market adoption.
Yeah, I think that I think that's a position I actually hadn't considered, but it makes sense, and I think it's a good counter to what the way I was thinking about it. So just to take a step back, I actually started working on a book, um, which takes all the conversations I had doing this podcast over the last year and kind of puts it into this is kind of the way, we're in a changing environment. Here are the ways that some of the most interesting revenue leaders are adapting and changing. Um, and when when the status quo is like really solidified, it becomes incredibly hard to move up, right? Like you have the head of the pack, and the barriers to crossing or catching up are just really, really solid.
And it largely looks like a pricing model where you're going based off of what the competition's doing.
Right. And there's also, I think, a consumer or a buyer mentality where it's like, well, it's Salesforce. We got to go with Salesforce. Like we couldn't even conceive. But when everything gets shaken up, the budgets are cut and interest rates are wild, and it makes this opportunity for people to capitalize on some of the chaos and gain ground. And I think HubSpot has done that. And to me, if they're consciously capitalizing on this right now, it would be very smart of them, which is like, now is the time to zoom ahead, because things are, people are still trying to get their bearings. And so that's what I see is happening. I do the pricing model as kind of a hint is interesting, because I know that they made a change to the pricing model, and it more supports, one of the things it does is it'll help a much smaller company be able to leverage the more powerful aspects of it without having to purchase seats they won't need. And that's an interesting counter argument to the one that says, well, this is really going after enterprise. Yeah, but I think it's, we're kind of talking about the two big dogs, as it were, in the race, but it's a pretty big ecosystem. Um, you work with clients and things like that. How have you seen the ecosystem or the kind of market of CRMs proliferate over the last few years? And have the kind of upstarts become more palatable to people?
Well, in all honesty, I think a big part of why HubSpot continues to do what they're doing is also in tandem to the genesis of pseudo CRMs, as they're kind of being come to name. And when I say a pseudo CRM, I'm talking like your bread and butter project management tools that are starting to incorporate a lot of CRM functionality. So if you
So like Monday.com and Airtable, that kind of thing. So like
exactly, you look at Monday, you look at ClickUp or Asana, all of them are starting to incorporate CRM features that are intended to streamline how you're doing your operations. And honestly, it's not a bad approach, because there's so many companies that are going purely off of the operations, and they have a CRM only to maintain their client database. And if you can maintain your project management and your clients in one spot, what's the need for having a third party tool? It's the same market play that HubSpot decided to really push forward with, back in 2017, when they really made the intention to expand and open out the different hubs instead of just being Marketing Hub and Sales Hub. Started launching out Service Hub, had the proof of concept for Operations Hub, Content Hub came out, and everything else within it just expanded to fit one of those categories. And so I think there's this big rush to try and keep that market share, because these other tools are finding ways to eke into the ecosystem, which is why, again, like we were talking about before the call, having conversations with someone who's using Acton as a CRM. And if you haven't used Acton, like it's a marketing automation system by trade, and many folks haven't heard of it because it's not that prevalent anymore. But if that's still starting to become a tool that's been recently adopted, that's showing an interesting shift in dynamics, because a tool you thought was maybe not gaining as much traction as you thought is still out there.
Yeah, it's a blast from the past. So, Act On back in, I don't know, 2011, something like that. They were a big player. They were right up there with like HubSpot and Marketo was the big dog.
They were up, they were above HubSpot. No one had heard of HubSpot. It was all Marketo or Acton, and if you didn't have anything, you kind of heard of this thing called Pardot. And
And he probably pronounced it wrong and said Pardo. And he probably pronounced it wrong and said Pardo.
yeah, exactly. And honestly, I'm still probably pronouncing it wrong, but who cares?
Yeah, this is a blast in the past because I've used all those tools. So I had experience with Acton, Pardot, Marketo, and still have kind of nightmares about it. Um, it's hard to imagine someone using that as purely a CRM, but it does. There is a world in which it does make sense. For sure, there's a world where things like, when you think about a CRM, just purely the CRM, and I think we talked about this in our last podcast, it's at its core, it's a relational database that's visual, right? It's different objects and different fields, and they relate to different other objects. Um,
It takes a spreadsheet and makes it pretty and accessible. That's all it does.
exactly. And that's at the core, right? But when we look at what things like HubSpot are doing and Salesforce in a lot of ways as well, as we're well beyond that, right? I mean, when we talk about custom objects as using it to the CMS to host dynamic web pages for real estate listings, we've gone way beyond what a CRM.
It's jargon to some people, and that's fair.
Yeah, and so there was this movement for a very long time. I mean, it still exists, but it was, I think, had a lot more steam, which was the kind of low code, no code thing, where basically you build your own, build everything. You don't have to code it. You just have a few tools that connect things together, and you can build something. And those databases like Airtable, Monday, Google Sheets, those often became kind of the back end, and you were able to kind of create whatever you wanted. And there was a time where I thought, you know what, maybe that's going to become the thing, and the concept of the headless CRM or whatever is going to take shape. Um, I'm not feeling the momentum I once did, um, but I'm interested. Like, we think of there is a whole bunch of CRMs I hadn't really even come across before. One of them, I think, that focuses much more on the lower end of the market would be something like Zoho, who seem to have a very similar business strategy that HubSpot, right? They create lots of, hubs. I don't know what their nomenclature for it is, and kind of go horizontally and kind of take over an organization. Um, do you have a lot of experience kind of dealing with that platform?
Yeah, I played a lot with Zoho, and to some degree other ones that are kind of in that space like Pipedrive. And honestly, to your point of that headless CRM, I think I disagree with you. I think that's a lot why tools like HubSpot and Salesforce are continuing to push out, well, HubSpot in particular, are pushing out resources and features left and right, because the dawn of Gen AI tools have allowed people to really DIY whatever they want, assuming they are able to articulate that effectively to the machine. And so you can take a tool like Monday and probably turn it into a marketing automation system with some robust uh, campaign tracking, just using that and MailChimp. All you really would need to do, and I'm not recommending or advocating for this, but like realistically, all you need to do is say, hey, I want to build this. You tell Zapier to do it. Zapier now has their AI that basically will build you a Zap based off of what you tell it to do. You throw that into play. And then if you're confused about where to plug things in, you hop on to a cloud or a chat GPT and ask it where to plug stuff in. And there you go. You set up a bidirectional sync in 2 hours, which would used to take probably a few weeks of complex time and effort to integrate.
So I've gone down this rabbit hole of like building internal tools where at the beginning it was a very clear vision and this would be great for everyone because I was thinking about my own use case. And then you get to the point where other people are starting to use it and you get input and they're like, oh, we need this here and this here. And at a certain point, you're like, HubSpot did all of this pain already. They've already, and like, it's, you ever see that meme where it's like the bell curve and it's like
I'm flashing back to the 90s meme of how to design a website.
I'm not familiar with that one. What's kind of the overall? I'm not familiar.
Oh, the premise of it is, what the client described. It's this beautiful articulate site, and then over time, it just turns into like this glittery, sparkled nightmare full of like animated gifs that just is so not what the client was asking for, and yet it's what you deliver, and then it doesn't work, and it you should look it up. It's pretty funny.
I think that's kind of missing the final piece, which is like you realize, you know what, you should have just stuck with the thing, the original. That's kind of how it ends up being because it's once you have organization and other inputs, you realize that a lot of the stuff you hadn't considered was already baked. They had lots of people thinking through this, and so you end up just going back to the platform thing. And I continuously find myself doing that in all sorts of stuff. Um, but going back to the ecosystem and its CRMs, I think that there was always this conception that Salesforce was the default, and especially at a certain size. There was really nothing else out there that you were going to consider. I think there's been some interesting challenge to that from Microsoft as well. So Microsoft Dynamics, we rarely talk about it, but they have gobbled up market share in a lot of industries where I think tech companies weren't competing as hard, which is like manufacturing and some of the more kind of non-techy industries. You see a huge,
It's all over banking.
yeah, yes, as well, yeah, because they have this very interesting model where it's land and expand extreme, right? You start with Word, you end up with Teams, and then you end up with this, and then all of a sudden you might as well get Dynamics, and then you might as well get all these other kind of pieces to it, and it becomes this increasingly large ecosystem, which I think they actually go wider than HubSpot does because they'll focus on back office tools and Word document generation and things like that. And so it's, and then maybe you and I also had this conversation where I think we kind of disagreed about if what Google would have even done with HubSpot had they purchased it. Because my initial thing was, oh well, the innovation cadence they have would just die. There's no way that they could keep up that pace. But I think it was you that made this point, which is, it allows HubSpot to connect to Google Workspace, which has all of those pieces, and so it really could kind of take over a company entirely in the way that I think Microsoft has done as well.
Yeah, and that's exactly right. And I'm glad you brought that up because I think that's like you can use that Google versus Microsoft paradigm as a perfect example. You're starting up a company, you're going to adopt as many tools to do everything you can do for the least amount of cost. And you're probably not going to go with a Microsoft suite because bluntly like it's office features. You get Office, Word, PowerPoint, great. Now that with OneDrive exists, great. You have a cloud tool, but still, it's not really as accessible if you don't have that built into your system already. Versus, I know Google's a bit more accessible. Granted, Google overcomplicates the simple, but for $20 a month, $15 a month, you have everything you need to run a business plus an email. And that's pretty powerful. And once you're able to grow up large enough, you start realizing, okay, well, while this was really powerful and allowed me to go places quickly, you start running into all of those more corporate side of things, which is your IT security, your device moderation, as well as provisioning, and everything that kind of comes with the complexity of being a larger business. And that's where I think that we can see a similar parallel in that HubSpot had a lot of that to begin with, where it's like, okay, great, I can adopt as a small business and it'll get me about to, let's call it 50 ARR and 50 million ARR, sorry. And then once you get past that point, it's like, all right, well, I need to go enterprise now, and this just doesn't cut it for me anymore. And so when you're losing market share upstream, a lot of these tools are just trying to adapt for that more upstream so that you can get in sooner and stay there longer. And I think that's I think that's the case about any of these tools that we've talked about. They want to get you as soon as they can and keep you as long as they can, which is why there's more and more tools and features that are, yes, they still have their product niche and their market fit, but they're broader than that. And a good example of that is look at Motion Calendar. It's a fantastic AI driven calendar that is pretty much trying to do that, plus project management, plus a meeting booking link, and to a degree a CRM. And you kind of start thinking, why?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I would imagine that's a way to raise more money. Like, you have to be able to present a total addressable market to investors that's beyond the calendar thing, but, there's something valuable about having, like, the best calendar thing that in the world. There is a space for that, but I think that we shifted really, among other shifts that happened, the idea of, like, these point solutions that were just the best in class for a very specific thing, but that was a world we lived in for a while, and I think we have now entered the kind of larger ecosystem world where there's consolidation and less tools, um, less friction to expand those tools, um, and I think that's to HubSpot's benefit, to Salesforce's benefit in a lot of ways, and to the detriment of much smaller solutions that are for a very small sliver of the workflow. Um, Man, there's so many different ways I could take this conversation, but we're actually kind of running up on time here. Um, Before we do end, is there, why, if you could tell the folks at home where maybe they can learn more about you or some, the work you're doing, or maybe just,
Yeah, and like this time definitely came up quick, so definitely appreciate you having me on. But yeah, more than happy to talk about this with anyone who's interested. I'm available on LinkedIn. It's pretty easy. I'm just LinkedIn RPM Ossa. Works out really nicely, and the domain is same thing, rpmoconsulting.com. Feel free to reach out to me, and there's plenty else that we're doing in the ecosystem on the Let's Build side of things. So definitely look up Let's Build Media if you're specifically interested in the HubSpot side of things. There's a lot of fun stuff that we're kind of developing up over there. And don't forget about Sprocketeer.
yes, Sprocketeer is if for all the HubSpot folks out there, Sprocketeer is a community of HubSpot admins helping each other, and it's a lot of fun, and a really great place. Especially as we come up to inbound week at this point, or Dreamforce Week. They're happening at the same time this year, which is again another interesting data point to consider. They were very obviously like 1 week after the other. It seemed like there was kind of a decision in the smoke filled back room somewhere last year about to do that, and I think this year they threw that to the wind, which again I think is just another points to another kind of interesting data point about this head to head going on. All right, but we'll have to maybe continue this, have a part two of this at some point in the future. But thank you so much, Brian, and thanks everybody for joining us today. We'll check back in with you maybe a little bit further down the road to see if some of our predictions here today have come true.
Yeah, we'll touch base after inbound. We'll see what happens.